had to shut it off. And we have an inbuilt impediment for democratic societies when they want to act strategically. You can act strategically when you say to yourself, this is what I want to do, this is the decision I have made, and now everybody will do whatever the government, whatever the leader says, and then we will do A and B and C because this is what we believe is the best to do. And this is long range, and this goes over the span of one government in democratic countries. And this is something that is not requiring any kind of persuasion, because somebody makes the decision, somebody dictates it, and others carry it on. And the assumption is that this way you will be more effective. And in a way you are, up to a certain point. But the question is, what happens when you have this inbuilt impediment in you? And you have to ask yourself, how can I bypass it? How can I divert my political action in a direction that will make my shortcomings less effective and my strengths more effective? And here I think we people who discuss strategic thinking can have a major contribution, because correct strategic thinking can come out with a plan of action that will make strategic action more possible even in a democratic society, in spite of the impediments that I mentioned before. And let me only qualify it with one element that we need to think about, and perhaps I should bring it at the end, but I think it would be interesting to think about it also during the lecture. We are having now in China an example that has never existed in human history, namely a totalitarian system that is more totalitarian than any system since the beginning of history, because technology makes it possible for the government to become involved in every action of every person more than ever before, and to monitor what every person does more than ever before. And we are at the crossroad where it is very interesting to find out, and extremely important for Western civilization to find out, if the Chinese can do something with an authoritarian system that democracies have failed to do because of the inbuilt impediments that they have. So far, we've been in a very fortunate situation where the good guys, the people with the values that Western society supports, were also the strongest. We were afraid that Stalin will overtake us, and then the Soviet Union crumbled. We were afraid at a certain point in time that Nazi Germany will find a more effective way to dominate us so that these advantages cannot come to the fore, and Nazi Germany was defeated. And now we're facing a completely new challenge because of the option of a really totalitarian system of the kind we've never seen before. So let's think about it when we bring up the discussion, when we proceed with the discussion, and keep that in the back of our minds. And there's another thing that we have to consider, and this is not future. This is already what is happening today. We used to have strong democratic, advanced, rich societies, facing also authoritarian and tribal and unsuccessful and failing societies, but they couldn't impose their ways on us because they were also weak. Because when it came to this imposition, we could prevent with our military forces any attempt of them to disrupt our life. And what we see in recent decades is technological developments that make it possible even for not only authoritarian and tribal societies, but even small groups and even underdeveloped nations to hit us where it hurts us the most. Because it is very easy to build rockets and missiles that can reach our population centers. And if you only have a very few people, usually trained by us, who are very good with cyber warfare, they can infiltrate us through a system where we are, if not helpless, at least very vulnerable, because we depend on these systems very much. So the threats to democratic society are rising. It's a different kind of threat than we had before. Before, in order to threaten democratic countries, you needed to have a totalitarian superpower or a power, namely the Soviet Union, to give one example, or Nazi Germany, to give another. Here, you can threaten, develop strong, rich societies, even if you are a backward tribal society that is incapable of dealing with the challenges of the 21st century, because technology made it possible for such societies to hit us in a way that I would not say makes us helpless, but it makes us extremely vulnerable. So the challenge is the following. How do you defend yourself effectively in spite of the fact that you have this inbuilt impediment of the need to convince people, because you cannot dictate beyond a certain point? And how do you do it? And here I come to the core of the question. How do you do it without hurting the core of your values? You can adjust yourself. You can give up certain freedoms in a very minor way because you want to be a defensive democracy. But whereas before, what we've learned from the Weimar Republic, we could say, okay, so no legal Nazi party in Germany. So, okay, there are some limitations on the freedom of speech when there is an agreement that this is being used by radicals in order to destroy the society. This kind of defensive society was easier than the kind we have now, with very different threats, both from China emerging, we're not seeing it yet implemented in a major way, or what we already have, namely these societies that can hurt us, and actually they have a deep satisfaction of hurting us, even if they have no constructive objective whatsoever. So let me put it perhaps in a somewhat different way. How do you keep yourself alive without losing the meaning of life? How can you be strong enough and defend yourself against very different challenges and threats than before without giving up the core of your value? The challenge is much more difficult. And here are two elements that I think we should focus on. First of all, how do you deal with your purists who tell you, after all, we're about freedom. How can we restrict freedom? After all, we're about equality. How can we treat different people in an unequal way? We're about opening the world. How can we close ourselves if we don't want to be threatened by the kind of dangers that we don't have a good defense against? And the challenge is to look at the overall strategic objective. Now, this is a subject that I've already discussed in our meetings in Vienna 3 years ago and 2 years ago, so I will only mention it very, very shortly to remind us what is required for strategic thinking. You need to see the overall picture, in other words, to deal with everything that affects your national security. You need to find, and this is the most difficult, to find the center of gravity. What are the most important things that you need to deal with? You need to adjust yourself to change, and you need to look at the long range and medium range consequences of policies that you're taking now. More specifically, let me put it this way, you need to see the whole picture, and instead of trying to get the maximum of everything that you believe is important, you need to find the optimum of the combination between all things that are important in their proper perspective. Because you can be perfect on A and B, but the combination of A and B and Z in the final analysis will be weaker if you are perfect on the things that you have chosen because you're ideologically committed to. So how can you have, and by the way, what I've just mentioned has a name. It is called responsibility. In other words, when you look only on part of the picture, you're being irresponsible because you're so obsessed with wanting to get the maximum of something that you like, that you do it at the expense of something that you cannot afford to disregard, because the whole structure will not hold for a long time. What is the difficulty? I've already mentioned it, I'll elaborate on it a little more. What is the difficulty of democracies particularly? You need to convince people because there are only so many things you can enforce. And even if you can enforce certain things, if people don't do it of their own will, then they will be much less effective. The outcome will be much less positive than if they're convinced that they're doing the right thing. Now, what is the specific challenge? We are telling our people in democratic open societies, basically in the final analysis, the state is there for you. So we want your situation to be better, your quality of life to be better, your standard of living to be higher, your freedom to be unlimited, and so on. And we constantly tell people we want to improve your personal life. And sometimes you have to persuade people, give up things that are good for you individually, because it will strengthen the collective, and if the collective is not strong, then we cannot make sure that your personal welfare will be best served. Because your personal welfare can be best served if the collective will be stronger, and therefore we are asking you to give up in the short run things that you would very much like to have, so that in the foreseeable future, not in some ideal future where everybody will be happy, but in the foreseeable future, the strength of the collective will reflect itself also in improving your personal situation. This is very difficult to do, and in order to do it, you need to persuade people. I mentioned here 6 things, maybe it is not comprehensive enough, you can have 7, you can have 5, but I want to give the direction of what I think are the most important elements that you have to convey to your public in order to get the kind of public support that you cannot do without. You cannot do without people believing that what the collective is doing is the right thing, and you cannot do it unless they're willing to give much more than you can force them to give, because they're convinced they're doing it not only for some ideal concept of a society, but for something that will reflect itself also on their personal welfare and well-being. First, you have to convince them that being free also means being strong. Because if they believe that they must be strong against an enemy, and they cannot be strong if they're not free, they might give up portions of freedom that will undermine what I called before the meaning of life. So convincing them of something that I think is true, I would not have suggested that you need to convince people to do it if it were not true, if you look at the overall picture. Namely, that historically speaking, free societies are also the strongest societies. Now again, China is challenging it. I mentioned it in the beginning of my lecture because I wanted you to bring it into some of the considerations. But at least so far, historically, free nations are also the strong nations. And the reason they're strong, they can mobilize free will. And free will is much more effective than people who do things because they were forced to do it and they had no other choice. This is number one. Number two, and I know that in Europe what I'm about to say now is not very popular, and this to some extent corresponds with the last lecture we've heard before the break. Have pride in Western society. We have gone so far in the multi-culti direction that we forget that we are better than others, not only different, better than others. Being free is better, not different. Being free is better than being not free. Treating women equally is better, not equal, to societies that are enslaving their women. The Western values, if we forget our pride in these values, the values of pluralism, because we want the other to be happy, I am not interested in making the other happy at the expense of my commitment to the basic values of my civilization. I think it is a very destructive element and it undermines democracy. This is one of the examples of what I call purism. You want to be so perfect in your attitude to others that you forget that certain attributes of Western societies are superior to societies that don't. Not just different, superior. So the pride, in my view, is very important here. The third element, this is nothing new, everybody would come up with it. Admit your mistakes. You're strong enough to come to your people and to say, we tried it failed, it was a mistake, let us correct our ways. You should do it in terms of the values. But B, much more important, it is effective because this brings trust. If a person can admit, if a leadership can admit, if a country can admit that they made mistakes, I think it is important for the building of trust. But remember the difference between admitting a mistake and feeling guilty. There is a new sport that we have in recent decades. Everybody in Western society wants to feel guilty about something. Now, are there some things that Western society should be guilty about? Yes, very few. Usually, you make mistakes, you admit your mistakes, you change your way, and don't develop a culture of guilt. Number 4, again, extremely important in my view. Be very careful to the very destructive element that comes under the code name the slippery slope. In other words, if you're not perfect in one thing, people immediately assume that you must go to the other extreme. If you stop defending the sovereignty of the nations in Europe, you're immediately a fascist. Okay? Just a minute. Democracy and pluralistic societies are not about perfection in any direction. You don't have a perfect security and you don't have a perfect freedom. You're trying to find this kind of combination between security and freedom that will keep you alive thanks to the security and make your life meaningful thanks to the freedom. But if you go to one extreme, assuming that anything except the pure thing must be a slippery slope towards the other extreme, then you're undermining the entire system of Western civilization. It is about the balance between the two. There is a tension. Treat the tension. This is what a democratic regime is all about. Finding non-violent ways, agreed ways, to deal with tensions. But don't assume this slippery slope, misuse of the term slippery slope, that you must be the extreme on anything that you are advocating. Number 5, try not to commit yourself to too many principles. If you say, if A, then B, then sometimes A comes in a form where B can make it worse. So say our overall objective is this and that. We will try to approach it as much as we can, given the circumstances, but don't lock yourself in the kind of principles where your enemies can manipulate you into doing things that will be counterproductive. Last but not least, and it was already mentioned indirectly, when you are trying to balance different values, don't lose your self-confidence speaking to radicals, narcissists, and purists. In other words, life is complicated. Pluralistic societies are find compromise between different needs, and again, we are seeking the optimum of the combination, not the maximum of each component of it. I want to give a few examples of what I've said so far, because this was more on the analytical level. I think it can be helpful if I will bring examples. And with your permission, I want to bring examples from Israel, not only or not primarily because I come from Israel and I know the system and I've been involved in it for decades, but also because Israel is a laboratory. Israel is the only free democratic country that for generations is in a constant state of war with existential elements of the threat. Not every threat is existential, but some of the threats have existential elements for it. No other society had to live with it year in and year out, generation in and generation out. You had the Second World War, 5 years, 12 years, depending where you were. You have another World War, again, a few years. Most countries, all countries that are democratic and open have not been in constant war like Israel. So here you have a challenge that is different and therefore a very interesting laboratory. Let me bring two fundamental things and then a list of things that have to do with deterrence. This is a key element in strategic thinking. First of all, let me take two very important and fundamental issues about Israel. Speaking about convincing people to do things that are bad for them in the short run, but have proved to be very good in the long run, convincing them to do it in the short run. Israel, in my lifetime, the population of Israel grew almost 20 times as much as it was when I was born. Okay? We incorporated in Israel a huge population far beyond the population of the people who were here when the State of Israel was established. To give only one yardstick, we used to be 6% of the Jewish people. Today we're almost 50% of the Jewish people in Israel. We used to be less than 500,000. Today we're close to 10 million. So we're speaking about a huge influx of people. Most of them came to Israel without economic capital or without human capital or without human and economic capital. So it required a huge investment into people, and this brought down the Israeli standard of living. But Israelis understood that when these people come, they make Israel stronger, not only militarily and economically, but also as a society, and therefore they understood that when their standard of living is hurt, it is for a purpose that they really want to have. And I think that were it not with the consent of the people, it would not be politically possible to do it in Israel, and it was done. Number one. Number two, the Israeli army. I don't know how many of you know about the Israeli army. We brought to Vienna the deputy chief of staff, and he was discussing it. My favorite description of the Israeli army is that the Israeli armed forces are not really an army. They are some kind of a crossing between a militia and a youth movement. Let me put it to you this way. In the 3 years that I served in the Israeli army, I was in prison only for 1 week. In every normal army, I would spend the 3 years of my service sitting in prison. Okay, this is an army that could tolerate even me. And I think this is an extremely badge of honor for the Israeli army. Now, why did Israel have such an army? First of all, because everybody in Israel believes that everybody else is an idiot, so nobody should have the right to tell him what to do. But something much more fundamental. The army in Israel has a tremendous impact on the Israeli society. And if we had an army, a democratic army, I'm speaking about something like the American army or the British army, I'm not speaking about totalitarian armies. If we would have had in Israel a real army, it would have militarized the society. Okay? The Israeli society would be militarized because the army is such an important component of the Israeli society. So we have demilitarized the army, not in the sense that we don't give them weapons, not in the sense that they cannot undertake military operations, but in the sense that the army is not a militaristic organization. Take, for instance, the fact that the person who was speaking to you in Vienna, and he was the deputy chief of staff, this person is now a member of the most left-wing party in Israel, Yair Golan, okay? He's a member of Meretz. And many of the generals of the Israeli army retire from the army and join parties, and it is usually either the center left or the left where they're going. Very few are going to the right. So this is only one indication, but it again shows that when you have people who understand the need to have an army that is not militaristic, you can do it. To give you an example, when you are a commander of the army, the mother of your soldiers have your cell phone number. And trust me, you don't want to be on the wrong side of a Jewish mother, okay? So you can understand that Israelis have taken precautions against something that they believe is dangerous, namely militarizing the society. Let me give now a few examples of something that is absolutely crucial. As far as I'm concerned, this is the number one critical element. Without this, Israel cannot exist. And this is deterrence. Israel exists thanks to deterrence. Even peace exists thanks to deterrence. Deterrence is by far the most important thing. But here, let me show you some elements that seem to undermine deterrence, but actually strengthen deterrence. First of all, we have made this deepest, the strongest, the largest investment in the history of mankind, okay, in the history of wars, into preventing innocent casualties, okay? The reason we have done it, no army ever in history or today in the world is investing so much as preventing collateral damage on the enemy's side. And the reason is not that they're nice people. Anybody in Vienna who knows me, that being nice is not exactly my number one quality, and many Israelis don't exactly take pride in being nice. That's not the point. The point is that the Israeli society would not let the Israeli army do in its name what it is doing, if the Israeli society were not convinced that the Israeli army is taking more precautions than anybody else in this category. And without having this support of the Israeli society, you cannot have a people's army. And without a people's army, a conscription army, you cannot defend Israel. So, in order to be more deterrent, you're more careful not to hit uninvolved civilians, innocent civilians, in the enemy, in spite of the fact that the enemy puts their missiles in kindergartens and in hospitals and in mosques because they want you to hit their civilians. And it works because the Israeli society says, we have to do it, we take more precautions than anybody else, and unfortunately in war, it doesn't always work. But we're trying to do more than anybody else has ever tried. Second, the understanding that sometimes in order to have deterrence, don't respond to military confrontations. In 91, Israel was bombarded from Iraq. Israeli cities suffered 39 missiles fired from Iraq, missiles that are equivalent to the V2, if you want to have something outside the system, Scud missiles and their equivalents, if you know the instrument. And Israel did not respond. And it strengthened the Israeli deterrence when the Israelis did not respond. Because the Iraqis wanted Israel to respond so that the American-based coalition will be dissolved, and Israel could sustain it without responding in order not to give the Iraqis their strategic desire. So from an Israeli point of view, not reacting to a major confrontation strengthened deterrence. You have it for 3.5 years in the Gaza Strip. They were shooting missiles into Israeli cities. Israel practically did not respond. The reason was we were engaged in a war with Iran in Syria, and we didn't want another front in Gaza. Did it help Israeli deterrence? Not responding? Yes. The third element, very interesting. When only recently, a few weeks ago, we had a war with Gaza, and 70% of the Israelis were sitting in air raid shelters. In Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in where have you, throughout the state of Israel. And when you interview people in air raid shelters and you ask them, you know your house may be destroyed now because missiles are falling on your city. Their response is usually, we are willing to sit in the air shelter longer, provided you hit the enemy very hard, because they understand that suffering now, sitting in air raid shelters, will have the benefit of more deterrence when you bring more destruction to the fighting forces of the enemy during a war. Something that is, number 4, directly related to Europe. Israelis are willing to get very, very severe criticism from Europe and from people who share their values, saying, they don't understand what's going on, we will do whatever we need, they don't like us, it's a pity. Journalists don't like us, it's a pity, but we will not listen to what they say. And it's not easy, because when Israel is criticized by barbarians, I don't know, from Syria, from Libya, from Cuba, from Venezuela, then of course it's ridiculous. I mean, if they hate us, we must be doing the right thing. But the Europeans that we respect very much come to Israel and say, we are your partners in values, how can you behave this way? And the Israelis say, look, we know what we're doing, And we will take your criticism, but making the Arabs understand that they cannot get away with what they're doing, making our enemies, whoever they are, understand that they cannot get away with what they're doing is more important. Last but not least, to understand that proportionality is not mechanical. It's not that if they use force against you by firing 2 bullets, it is proportional to fire 2 bullets at them. This is some kind of stupid and mechanic proportionality. The proportion you will stop making our life impossible. It's a very different concept of proportionality that I think Europeans have difficulty in understanding, and Israelis are committed to. Let me end by repeating what I said in the beginning, and now in the context of all the examples that I've given, perhaps it will be more clear. We need to optimize the entire system. We pay with being not perfect on one thing because it is much more important to get another thing at a specific moment, and in another moment you give up here in order to get up to get there. In other words, look at the overall picture and convince your people that even if it is difficult now, it is worth investing in going through a difficult period of time because the structure is more sustainable. What you're doing is digestible and the structure is sustainable. And I'm coming to the 2 elements that I mentioned before when I spoke about the practitioners, the sustainability and the digestibility. Do what you can actually convince people to do, and do it in a way that whatever you achieve will be strong enough and you will be resilient and you will be able to sustain your objective over a long period of time. Thank you.
Dear sir, dear professor, it was a fireworks of brilliant ideas, of smart reasoning, of smart pieces of strategic advice. Thank you very much for that. We highly appreciate it, and we would have been very much happier if you could have been with us in person. Thank you very much. We are running out a little bit of time, so I would suggest the following. As it is about the time schedule of General Zitkowitz and General Schellais, I will ask the both generals if they have questions towards you. If so, I would kindly ask you to answer them, but I must beg for your understanding that all the other questions, we will have to postpone it until our next meeting, if that will be okay for you.
Auf die nächste Strategiekonferenz verweisen. Ich hoffe, das ist in Ordnung für Sie, Herr Professor, und auch für das Publikum.
So, I see General Commander of the National Defense Academy and General Schellais, our guest. They have no questions at the moment. So again, thank you very much, sir, for the presentation and for the precise and provocative and, in any case, fruitful recommendations you gave to us. Thank you very much, sir.